It's 11:30 at night in a flat in Rotterdam. You're sitting at your kitchen table with a laptop open to two browser tabs. One shows a rental listing, €1,300 a month for a two-bedroom apartment. The other is a mortgage calculator. You punch in the numbers for a similar place. €320,000, 20% down payment, 4.2% interest rate. The monthly payment comes out to €1,400. Looks almost the same, right? But then you add in the property transfer tax, notary fees, maintenance reserves, and the €64,000 you'd need just to walk through the door. You close the laptop, stare at the ceiling, and wonder how an entire continent ended up in a situation where neither option makes any financial sense. That question is exactly what we're going to answer today, because the data behind Europe's housing market in 2026 reveals something most people are not prepared to hear. My name is Leo, and I hold a degree in European economics and business. I've spent 9 years analyzing economic data and tracking market indicators across Europe. You'll notice I use animation in these videos instead of appearing on camera myself. Why? Because I find that cartoons and visual storytelling make complex economic topics far more accessible and, let's be honest, more watchable. Economics can be dry, but the insights don't have to be. My focus is on giving you data-driven perspectives on European markets and practical strategies for navigating economic uncertainty. If you're trying to make smarter decisions about housing, money, and your financial future in Europe, please subscribe and leave a like if you find this content valuable. Today, I'm going to walk you through the real economics of renting versus buying across Europe in 2026, country by country, number by number. By the end, you'll have a framework for making this decision based on data, not emotion, not what your parents told you, and certainly not what a real estate agent wants you to believe. But first, you need to understand the structural shift that created the trap you're sitting in right now. Here is the foundation that most people miss entirely. According to Eurostat's 2025 Housing in Europe edition, EU house prices have risen 53% since 2010. In that same period, rents across the EU went up only 27.8%. Think about what that divergence means. Property values have been climbing at nearly double the rate of rents. This creates an enormous gap between what it costs to own a home and what it costs to rent one. That gap is expressed in something called the price-to-rent ratio, and in 2026, those ratios across Europe have reached levels that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. In parts of Germany, the price-to-rent ratio has stretched to 39 years. That means it would take 39 years of equivalent rent payments to equal the purchase price of a property. This is not a normal market. This is a market where prices have decoupled from the income they're supposed to serve. But here's what makes this truly difficult to navigate. The rental market isn't sitting still either. Estonia has seen rents explode by 220% since 2010. Lithuania, 84%. Hungary, 24%. Ireland, on 15%. The only EU country where rents have actually declined over that period is Greece, down about 11%. So you're caught between two forces. Property prices that have soared beyond what most incomes can support, and rental markets that are tightening in nearly every major economy. There's a critical factor we'll examine in a moment, one involving interest rates, that makes the buying side of this equation even more painful than the sticker price suggests. But first, let me show you what the country-level data reveals, because Europe is not one housing market, it's dozens, and each one tells a different story. What comes next is the core analysis, where we break down the 5 European markets that best illustrate why this decision is so different depending on where you live. Let's start with Germany, because Germany is the only country in the EU where renting is the majority lifestyle. 53% of German households rent, 47% own. This is the inverse of almost every other European country, and it exists for structural reasons, strong tenant protections, a cultural acceptance of long-term renting, and a historically stable rental market. But that stability is cracking. According to data analyzed by Köln, German house prices actually fell 1.6% in 2024. You might think that's good news for buyers. Except, the rental market is tightening simultaneously. Only 25,000 new apartments are expected to be completed in 2026, far below the estimated annual need. Berlin's rent control laws have created a two-tier market. Controlled rents are affordable, but nearly impossible to access. Market rate rents for new listings are climbing sharply. The result is a paradox. Buying is slightly more affordable than it was 2 years ago, but renting, the thing Germany is supposed to be good at, is getting harder and more expensive. If you're in Germany, the math now depends almost entirely on how long you plan to stay. Short term, renting still wins. But the longer your horizon, the more the calculus shifts, especially if the supply shortage deepens. Now let's move to the Netherlands, where the situation has an entirely different character. Dutch house prices rose 8.2% in 2025 alone. That's not a gentle recovery, that's acceleration. Price-to-rent ratios in cities like Amsterdam and Utrecht now suggest that renting is mathematically superior in the short and medium term. But here's what the data actually shows when you look deeper. The Netherlands has rent regulations that cap increases for existing tenants. This sounds protective, but it creates scarcity. Landlords facing capped returns exit the rental market. Fewer rental units become available. The ones that do hit the market command higher prices for new tenants because only new leases can be set at current rates. So the people who benefit most from rent regulation are the ones who already have a lease. If you're searching for a new rental in the Netherlands, you're competing in one of the tightest markets in Europe. The Dutch government has reduced the property transfer tax from 10% to 8% effective in 2026, which helps buyers marginally, but the fundamental barrier remains the same. Down payments, transaction costs, and elevated mortgage rates mean you need roughly 30 to 40% of the property value in cash or equity just to get started. Here's where it gets interesting. Because Spain presents perhaps the most impossible math of all. Spanish house prices rose approximately 16% in 2025, with some forecasts from Global Property Guide placing the 2025 annual growth at 8.5%. Mortgages in Spain typically require a 20 to 30% down payment. For a €250,000 apartment, that's 50 to 75,000 euros. The average Spanish salary makes saving that amount a multi-year, sometimes multi-decade, endeavor for young people. Meanwhile, Barcelona has implemented rent controls that mirror Berlin's experience, creating similar two-tier dynamics. In Spanish cities, the European Parliament's 2025 Housing Crisis Report found that housing cost overburden, meaning spending more than 40% of disposable income on housing, disproportionately affects urban renters. And yet, buying remains locked behind a wall of capital that most first-time buyers simply cannot climb without parental help. We're halfway through the analysis, and this is where theory meets practice. Because so far, we've been looking at prices and ratios. Now let's examine the mechanism that transformed the buying equation more than anything else: interest rates. For roughly a decade, European mortgage rates sat between 1 and 1.5%. That era is over. In 2026, rates across the Eurozone remain elevated at 4 to 5%. According to the ING Think Eurozone analysis, this single shift has made monthly mortgage payments 30 to 40% higher than they would have been for the same property just 3 years ago. Let me put that in concrete terms. A €300,000 mortgage at 1.5% over 25 years costs you roughly €1,200 a month. The same mortgage at 4.5% costs approximately €1,670 a month. That's an extra €470 every single month, nearly €5,700 a year for the exact same property. This is why the rent versus buy comparison has fundamentally changed. In Belgium, according to AFinance's 2026 analysis, mortgage payments now consume approximately 30% of household income, compared to about 25% for renting. Belgium's home ownership rate is still around 75% because Belgians understand that renting builds no equity. But starting January 2026, Belgium introduced a new 10% capital gains tax on property. This changes the investment calculation for buyers who previously counted on tax-free appreciation as a core wealth-building mechanism. There's a regulatory nuance here that changes everything. But first, consider Switzerland, which represents the extreme end of this spectrum. Swiss gross rental yields sit between 2.5 and 3.5%. The vacancy rate is just 1%. Investorpers' 2026 Swiss rental market analysis describes a market so tight that even high earners struggle to find adequate housing. When your rental yield is below your mortgage rate, the pure financial math says renting is cheaper than owning. But when vacancy is at 1%, finding a rental is its own impossible challenge. This is the paradox playing out across much of urban Europe. The numbers say rent. The market says good luck. Now let me address the hidden costs that most rent versus buy calculators ignore entirely. When you buy a property in Europe, transaction costs vary dramatically. In the Netherlands, even after the 2026 reduction, you're looking at approximately 8% in transfer taxes and fees. Germany adds notary costs and land registry fees totaling roughly 7 to 10% of the purchase price, depending on the state. Belgium has registration duties that can reach 12.5% in some regions. Beyond the purchase, maintenance costs run 1 to 2% of property value annually. For a €300,000 home, that's 3 to 6,000 euros a year that renters simply don't pay. When you factor in a realistic purchase scenario, a buyer needs 20 to 30% for a down payment plus 5 to 10% for transaction costs. That means 30 to 40% of the property value must be available before you even move in. On a €300,000 property, that's 90 to 120,000 euros. For the average EU household spending 19% of disposable income on housing, according to Eurostat. Saving that amount is a generational project, not a personal one. Now let's examine the psychology behind this, because the rent versus buy decision is not purely mathematical. If it were, the answer would be straightforward in most European cities. Renting is financially superior in the short to medium term in the majority of major markets. But human beings don't make housing decisions on spreadsheets alone. Here's the part that might challenge your assumptions. The drive to own property in Europe is deeply embedded in post-war culture. Home ownership represents stability, status, and intergenerational wealth transfer. In Southern and Eastern Europe especially, owning your home is not a financial decision. It's an identity. This is why home ownership rates in Romania exceed 95%, even though average incomes are a fraction of what they are in Germany, where only 47% own. The behavioral economics here are powerful. Loss aversion makes renting feel like throwing money away, even when the math shows otherwise. The endowment effect means that once you own a home, you psychologically overvalue it. Social proof drives people toward buying because everyone around them is buying or aspires to buy. This is the nuance that most sources skip. For Europeans under 35, the rational calculation heavily favors renting. You may relocate for career opportunities. You may not have a stable enough income to weather mortgage rate fluctuations. You likely don't have the 30 to 40% of property value needed for entry costs. But by age 35 to 40, the equation shifts. Family formation creates demand for stability. Children create demand for space. And the absence of equity accumulation over a decade of renting starts to compound into a real wealth gap compared to peers who bought earlier. The uncomfortable truth, supported by the PGIM Real Estate Outlook for Europe 2026, is that in most European countries, buying a home has become functionally impossible without family wealth. The European Parliament's February 2025 Housing Crisis Report found that housing cost overburden affects 10% of urban populations versus 6% in rural areas. In Greek cities, that number reaches 29%. In Danish cities, 23%. These aren't marginal populations. These are significant portions of urban Europe being financially crushed by housing costs, whether they rent or buy. Rent control, which politicians present as the solution, creates its own distortions. Berlin's rent cap, Barcelona's regulations, Paris's encadrement des loyers, all create two-tier markets where existing tenants are protected, but new entrants face scarcity and inflated prices on the open market. The supply side, which is the only real solution, remains chronically underbuilt across Europe. Germany's 25,000 expected completions in 2026 are a fraction of what's needed. Spain and the Netherlands face similar shortfalls. Without supply, every policy intervention simply redistributes pain rather than reducing it. Let me show you how all these pieces fit into a coherent strategy for your actual life. Remember that person sitting at the kitchen table in Rotterdam, staring at two browser tabs that both lead to financial frustration. Here's what they should actually be thinking. If you're in your 20s or early 30s, mobile, and without substantial savings or family support, renting is not just acceptable, it's optimal. Invest the difference between what you'd pay as an owner and what you pay as a renter. At current European equity market returns, that difference, compounded over a decade, can become your future down payment or an alternative wealth-building path entirely. If you're settling into a city for the long term, planning a family, and you have access to the 30 to 40% entry capital, buying begins to make financial sense on a horizon of 7 to 10 years or more. But only if you stress test the mortgage against potential rate increases, factor in maintenance and transaction costs, honestly, and don't stretch beyond 30% of your net income on housing costs. If you're in a rent-controlled market with an existing lease, do not give it up lightly. That lease may be the single most valuable financial asset you hold, more valuable in real terms than the equity you'd build in the early years of a mortgage. And if you're in a market like Switzerland or the Netherlands, where rental yields are below mortgage costs and vacancy is near zero, recognize that neither option is designed to serve you. Both are survival strategies in a structurally broken market. Your focus should be on income growth and investment outside of real estate. The system that created this situation, decades of underbuilding, monetary policy that inflated asset prices, and regulation that treats symptoms rather than causes, is not going to fix itself quickly. This is not a cycle. It's a structural condition. So go back to that kitchen table. Close the mortgage calculator and the rental listing for a moment. Open a spreadsheet instead. Calculate your actual total cost of renting over 5, 7, and 10 years. Do the same for buying, including every hidden cost we discussed. Compare both to a scenario where you rent affordably and invest the difference. The answer that emerges will be specific to your income, your city, your timeline, and your access to capital. That's the only honest answer, not a headline, not a slogan. A calculation rooted in your reality. What European housing topic would you like me to analyze next? Are you navigating a specific country's market and want a deeper breakdown? Let me know in the comments. The data is clear. In 2026 Europe, the rent versus buy question has no universal answer, but it does have your answer. If you're willing to run the numbers honestly, understanding the economics is one thing. Applying it to your life is what actually changes your future.